Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good wherever you are. I'm your host, That Lit Astro Chick, the channel where we discuss the natal charts of authors, artists, writers, and anyone else that I find interesting. So for today's natal chart, we are going to be discussing an author who has been one of the leaders of the Harlem Renaissance, as well as someone who was very beloved when I was a child, and then I kind of wandered away from his work when I was a little bit older. And I wanted to discuss his natal chart because I'm going to start his book, Not Without Laughter, today as a way of closing out today's or this month's Black History Month reading for me. And that's going to be the author Langston Hughes. And this one was a rather interesting birth chart. And it's interesting because I'm going to be doing the birth chart before I actually read his book. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the birth chart. And sidebar, I did find two different birth dates for him. I'm just going to go with the one that I found that was on the Wikipedia page. So that's going to be the one that I'm going to focus on for today. So Langston Hughes was born in Joplin, Missouri, United States on February 1st, 1901. We don't have the birth time. The assumption is that he is a Capricorn rising, but like I said, we don't know. So the first thing that I notice about Langston Hughes is that he does have the birth of one. So the birth date of one. So because he was born on the 1st, this means that he is somebody where independence was really important to him, as well as throughout his entire path of life. And that's because the number 1 is represented by the sun. So he could have been somebody who would have been more focused around those 5th house matters of creativity, children, investments, as well as men. And Langston Hughes was assumed to have been gay throughout his lifetime. However, it was something that he was very quiet about. And I say this because in his chart, the one that was for 1901. So that's the chart that I'm going to use. He does have his moon in opposition to his Venus. So he has a Cancer moon, and that's in opposition to his Venus in Capricorn. Typically speaking, people who tend to have this type of hookup in their chart, they may have felt some type of way, specifically about the way that they were raised. And when it comes to a Cancer moon, the moon is in its home when it's in Cancer, so it's dignified. So this could have been a home that he was raised in, that perhaps there was a lot of discussion around race and the consideration of race. Specifically because he does have his Cancer moon, and that is in fact running contra-parallel to his Chiron in Capricorn. And Chiron in Capricorn is going to refer to somebody where they may feel as though they have lacked respect, authority, as well as being honored for their work. So someone who has Chiron in Capricorn, they're not going to be as honored as much for those 10th house matters as opposed to people who don't have it. But what I was saying is that because he does have his moon in opposition to Venus, this would, to me, indicate that maybe his romantic relationships with women were not the primary part of his life. And in fact, he could have been involved in perhaps a lot of love triangles with this type of setup. So maybe he could have been the type of person who would have dated a lot of married men, or men that had girlfriends, or men that had wives or baby mamas. And that was very common during this time because it wasn't considered to be as in vogue, not in vogue, but I want to say the LGBT rights, the queer rights, they weren't considered to be as acceptable as they are in current times. And I still think that the way that we think about those rights is very much regressive. But he would have had to have hidden this type of desire that he possibly could have had. So just a quick note about the sun. His sun is conjunct to his Mercury in Aquarius. And I am finding that this is very common in a lot of authors' charts, at least so far, because Mercury is exalted when it's in Aquarius, because it's going to refer to having an excess of a lot of different types of ideas that this person is going to have and that they're going to be able to combine with others in ways that are going to be new and very inventive. As I had said before, I haven't read Langston Hughes since I was a kid, but I did remember that last line of A Dream Deferred and how it was italicized, "What if it explodes?" And that was supposed to mimic an explosion, and it was like the coolest thing ever when I was a kid. So there is, of course, that desire for invention that's going to come along with his Sun conjunct Mercury. And he also is most likely someone who spearheaded this because Aquarius is one of the signs of the trendsetters, because it's a planet represented by Uranus that is all about invention. It's all about separation. It's all about going against the status quo. Aquarius is also the sign of homosexuality. So if Langston Hughes was gay, and I believe that he was, this was something that was very much on his mind. And because he does have his Sun conjunct Mercury, I think that he may have figured out some way to try to make peace with that, or try to maneuver it so that it doesn't cause as many upsets in his life. And I say that because he does have his Mercury sextiling his Uranus and Sagittarius. And Uranus and Sagittarius is going to oftentimes refer to somebody who is going to have this expectation to change their ideas. That's going to be an entitlement that they're really going to hold on to in this particular lifetime or in this incarnation. Uranus and Sagittarius is also going to refer to somebody who most likely has had to have a lot of major moves throughout their life. So while Gemini could be seen as being for the streets, colloquially speaking, Sagittarius would be seen as being like for the highways. They would be for the state. They would not actually say for the whole planet. Maybe. But the point I'm trying to make is that when it comes to the ways that he could have thought about his relationships to women, as well as his relationships to his own sexuality, it was going to be something very front and center within his mind. And I wonder if this could have something to do with maybe his North Node. And I say that because his North Node is at the 28th degree of Scorpio. Like I said before, we don't have the birth time, but I'm going to assume that his North Node is either in his 7th or his 8th house. So that would have meant that a lot of his karmic contract in this last incarnational life that he had was most likely going to be due to the exploration of his sexuality. So either through his partnerships or through getting support from other people. And in addition to that, I do believe that he was someone who did receive a lot of support, specifically when it came to communication, because he does have his Sun trining with his Pluto in Gemini. I believe that the author Ann Petrie also had her Pluto in Gemini. So Pluto in Gemini is going to refer to a time when there was a lot of advancement in terms of communication. We had the invention of the phone, because Gemini does deal with phones, as well as more of a focus on the written word. So like with your newspapers, your publishing, your poetry, all of that was definitely going on in Gemini with Pluto and Gemini. And this was also a time when people were going to be focused a lot on what was going on within their neighborhoods, as well as urbanization, because Pluto and Gemini was also the tail end of the Great Migration, which happened after slavery was abolished in the South. You had a number of people, I would say that a lot of these people would have been considered rejects in some ways, or unable to integrate into society in some other ways, who moved up to the north in hopes of finding employment. And Langston Hughes was a part of that. So I would say that I definitely do see that Uranus in Sag, specifically because he was born in Missouri, but he rose to prominence and fame in Harlem in New York. So this would represent somebody who I think would be very focused on major moves, as well as having the right to the moves. However, even though he did have the right to make those moves, and he was somebody who really did challenge his ideals, and he also could have been someone who was very much focused on accepting himself as being different, as well as accepting other people as being different. And I say that because he does have his Mercury and his Sun, and those are sextiling his Uranus and Sagittarius. He also would have been somebody who, I think unfortunately he would have led a life that would have been very lonely. And I say that because his Uranus is in opposition to that Gemini Pluto. So he would have been somebody who would have been very focused on doing his own thing, and maybe perhaps due to those changes of ideas, he may not have had anywhere near as much support as maybe what he would have wanted. And I also say that because he does have his Neptune, and that's in opposition to his Uranus, and his Neptune is in Gemini. So maybe from his perspective, he didn't quite get all the support that he wanted, but he also may have been somebody to where he could have been off in his own little world in some way, unfortunately. So I do see that, especially when it comes to this. He also could have been somebody who would have been maybe more focused on guarding his reputation, as well as being more thoughtful in terms of his actions. And I say that because he has his Mars in Virgo, and that is trining with his Saturn in Capricorn, as well as his Jupiter, which is also in Capricorn as well. Those the Jupiter and the Saturn, they aren't conjunct, but they are running parallel to each other. So in this instance, he would have been somebody who would have been maybe more focused on his reputation. And I say that he does have his Jupiter trining not Saturn. His Jupiter trines his Mars, and this is usually going to be the aspect of someone who will be very careful in terms of the ways that they move, especially when it comes to their sexuality. Like, I would also assume that he probably was somebody who was seeing people maybe on the regular and other people didn't know about it, because he does have his Sun in quincunx to Mars. But he also would have been someone who would have been very protective and regarding his reputation, because he does have that Mars trining that Saturn in Capricorn. And this would have been something that he would have been very good at, because he does also have his Jupiter. Of course, my cat has to scratch at the door. He does have his Jupiter, and that is at the 2nd degree of Capricorn. And Jupiter in Capricorn is usually, it's going to be fallen in that position. So he could have been somebody where maybe at a party, he would not have been the life of the party. He most likely would have been somebody who would have been kind of quiet, I would assume, maybe a lot more observant. And he would have had more work in terms, or more success of his work in terms of if he was alone. And he probably did feel kind of lonely, I would say, because he does have that Mars in conjunct to his Chiron in Capricorn. In fact, I would say, looking at his chart, he could have been somebody where he would have maybe really strive for that acceptance, for that desire of respect, and maybe he felt like he never got it, and it could have been an area that could have tested his faith. And I say that he does have his Jupiter conjunct to his Chiron, and typically speaking, when Chiron is afflicting a personal planet, it's going to represent where something kind of strange went on. So that is definitely something that I would say that I would notice. I do think that when it came to his friends and people that he loved, he most likely did try to really work on those relationships, because he does have his Venus, and it does trine with his Mars, which is also in Virgo. But I think that maybe the desire that he could have had around strategizing around his life, it also, once again, was not in sync with what everybody else in the times was doing. And I say that because he does have his Mars is his Pluto. He also could have felt like he was someone who would have been maybe more focused on relying on other people for a sense of self, because he does have his Mars squaring his Uranus. I'm once again going to say I do think that he probably had a lot of partners within his lifetime, but perhaps he could have felt very, very sad about the state of it when it came to what exactly his partnerships were doing, how they were going about. And in some ways, and maybe he could have felt like because of the times, he would have maybe had been more secretive than he really would have liked. That's actually what I'm getting a lot with his he was somebody who was destined for greatness, especially when it came to his writing. And I say that because he does Mercury trining his Pluto. So this would be the sign of somebody who would be known very well for their writing. He also has his Saturn running semi-sextile to his Uranus. So this would have meant that he would have been very good at explaining difficult to understand concepts, especially to a lot of other different people. I'd also say maybe another aspect when it comes to the work that he has put out. He also has his Jupiter semi-sextiling his North Node. So maybe there could have been something about this level of isolation that he possibly felt that was going to be very helpful for him, especially in terms of the, now I'm going to move on and I'm going to just a little bit about some of his asteroids. I'm not going to go too much over those, only because I don't want this video to be too long. So I know that I've discussed the I really do like to talk about them, depending on some of the other astrologers and like the textbooks, like the later textbooks say that the nodes don't matter. I think that they really do matter a lot, because it does show us in terms of what it is that we are going to be focusing on in this lifetime, as well as what our experiences are going to be. Now, Langston Hughes was North Node. So that meant that he most likely came from many lifetimes to where he had spent his life being, basically being a square. He was somebody who was more focused on acquiring wealth and resources for himself, as well as being part of the mainstream and the standard, because Taurus, it represents the standard as well as value. However, in the last incarnation of life that he had, he was somebody who was supposed to experience the underbelly, so to speak. And I think that that's where you got that saying that that Harlem was Vogue. He was a part of society that was considered to be in vogue at this time, and one that we can sometimes look at as being like a stage of nostalgia. But it was really wild when I think about what was going on and how it was out of sync with what was going on with the rest of the country at that time. And it's really interesting now, especially because Pluto is an Aquarius, everybody's shameful, we letting it all hang out. And now not necessarily, going to be something that was going to happen. And when I look at his chart and I try to see, well, what areas were squaring his nodes, and the most obvious ones to me would be his Sun and his Mercury. So he really did have to change the way that he saw himself, as well as the way that he thought about things in order that North Node status. And I do believe that he did, but I also do believe that it was probably a very lonely journey for him. The last aspect that I'm going to talk about is his Lilith, and his Lilith was in Libra. So Lilith in Libra is usually going to refer to some type of an upset that happens with another person who's going to be a part of their journey. It could have represented maybe struggles in publishing, because Libra is the sign that deals with publishing. This also could be a sign that deals with upsetting a lot of people at one time, or a lot of people upsetting you at one time. But there could be desire for mental balance that would have upset a lot of people, unfortunately. But I am really glad that we do have his work in order to enjoy later on. And I am going to get into this book as soon as I'm done with the rest of the work that I actually need to do today. But that concludes the natal chart reading of Langston Hughes. Please give it thumbs up and subscribe, and I hope that you tune in for the next video.